So, we're going to talk today about Jewish politics, past and present. Some of you may remember the Monty Python movie, The Life of Brian, which came out in the 1970s. They actually just celebrated the 40th anniversary of that film. And one of the funniest scenes in the film is the political divisions within the Judeans at the time against the Romans. There's the People's Front of Judea, and their major opponents are the Judean People's Front. And they can't necessarily define exactly why they're different from each other. And then one of them says, what happened to the Popular Front for the Liberation of Judea? Oh, he's sitting over there. It's just one person. We know the stories about Jewish diversity of opinion that go back a long way. The idea that a man on a desert island will build two synagogues. One is the synagogue he attends, and the other is the synagogue he won't set foot in. The idea of two Jews and three opinions. Well, when it comes to politics, obviously you can imagine multiple parties as well. And I'll mention one other story that gets at the root of Israeli political culture, or Jewish political culture more broadly. So the story is that two brothers lived on opposite sides of a hill, and they were facing a famine. And each night, one brother would take some of his grain and sneak it into his brother's storage area, and then sneak back over. And it turns out his brother was doing the same thing to try to help the other side of the family. And one night they met on top of the hill. They realized what the other person was doing, and they fell to embrace each other and kissed, and that was the temple, that was the Temple Mount, the mountain on which the Jerusalem temple would be built. The other version of the story, perhaps more realistic, during a famine, two brothers live on opposite sides of a hill, but each night one brother sneaks over to the other side and steals some grain from his brother and then runs back, and the other one sneaks over and steals some grain. They meet each other on the hill in the middle, and they start fighting with each other, and that is the mountain on which they build the Israeli parliament building, the Knesset. Given the arguments going on right now in Israeli politics, that definitely reflects Jewish political culture. Now, we know that people are a social animal. Aristotle said it in his philosophy, but we've always lived in groups. I mean, even in the book of Genesis, it says, Lo tov heyot adam levado. It's not good for humanity to be alone. We need other people. We've always had other people. There really was no state of nature where individual rational agents signed a social contract to restrict their right. I mean, it's a nice, useful political theory, but it doesn't reflect what really happened. We always started as a clan, a tribe, a family, and then we came up with rules of how to manage those groups as they got bigger. When we think about the evolution of Jewish politics, the background of Jewish politics, we have to start with the Hebrew Bible. But keep in mind that the Hebrew Bible is not necessarily a credible source on all the details. You know, it's written many centuries later with a particular agenda, so we'll have to take it with a grain of salt. The earliest form of Hebrew organization that we see reflected there, aside from the mythological Exodus stories and God ruling with a pillar of cloud and a pillar of fire and commandments, and that's not reliable testimony, but the best evidence we can find, both archaeologically and in the text, is this period of the Judges, which is after the Exodus story. The Hebrew tribes enter the land of Israel, or the land of Canaan at the time, and they're divided into tribes. There's occasionally a warrior who's called a judge, but it's really more of a political leadership than a judicial role. These judges, or chieftains, are temporary leaders. They manage to assemble a few of the tribes together, they fight back against the Canaanites or the Philistines, and they gain a measure of autonomy for themselves, but then in the end, their kids are not as good as they were, or they die, and the fellowship falls apart. So in response to exterior threat, these tribes are able to unite temporarily, but it doesn't prove a lasting connection. In fact, sometimes they even fight with each other, and there's a conflict with the tribe of Benjamin that almost wipes it out in conflict with the other tribes. So it's not a sustainable political system, it's temporary chieftain. So what they do is the Hebrew people come to the prophet Samuel in the book of Samuel, and they say, choose for us a king like other nations. We need a king to keep us together. And initially, the prophet Samuel actually is concerned. He says, well, God's supposed to be the king. What do you mean choosing a human king? And in the end, he gets a prophecy that says, it's okay, you can choose a king. So ultimately, they try to ally these tribes under a monarchy with a centralized king. In the biblical narrative, you have King Saul. We don't actually have any archaeological record of King Saul, but we do have a record of King David. There's actually an inscription that refers to the Beit David, the house of David. And that inscription is about 100 to 200 years after David would have lived, so it suggests that there may have been a house of David of some kind. Now, was he good with a slingshot? We don't know. All the stories they tell about him, we can't necessarily rely on, but we at least know there probably was some kind of centralized king under David, and his son Solomon also manages to keep the kingdoms together. But the different tribes in the end don't last as a unified entity, because after Solomon, his son Rehoboam doesn't conciliate with the tribes. He wants more taxes, he wants more authority, and ultimately a group of 10 tribes in the north break away from this united kingdom, and they form their own kingdom called Israel. And in the south, based around Jerusalem, you have the southern kingdom called Judah, or Judea. This, by the way, is the origin in modern Israeli political debate of the phrase Judea and Samaria for those territories. That's where those divided kingdoms were, the north of Israel, the south of Judah. Archaeologists debate actually whether there ever was a united monarchy, or was it always a north grouping of tribes called Israel and a south grouping of tribes called Judah, and they made up a united kingdom period to claim they had some kind of unity at a later point. Well, that's an archaeological debate we don't have time to get into today. But there is real evidence of this divided monarchy period. We have a picture of a king from the north bowing down in tribute to an Assyrian king. It's the king named Jehu, or Jehu. He's called Yahu, I think, in the inscription in the Assyrian, but you have a picture of him bowing down, and he's Yahu of Isser, of Israel. So that's really exciting to see a picture. I mean, it's not the most flattering pose for the first picture of a Hebrew king, but at least it's something. We have inscriptions that reflect the reign of King Hezekiah, who's around the year 700 BCE. We have references to the house of Omri in the north, which is also one of the kings that's named in the Hebrew Bible. So we have a lot of outside evidence confirming that there are some kind of kings ruling in this area during that time period, 800, 700, 600 BCE. Now, we have to remember that a monarchy is not a democracy, so it might not be a good model for us today. And in this period, there's no separation of religion and government. The king is also like a high priest. Hezekiah goes and talks to Yahweh directly. He doesn't need a prophet to work in between. Sometimes the prophets do correct the kings, but sometimes the kings run the sacrificial worship. And even someone who's a resident alien living in the territory still has to offer the Passover sacrifice because you're subject to the laws of the state, including the religious laws and the religious practices. To be a good citizen in that time meant to also support the state cult, the state religious institution. So this is not a case of you have the priests on one side, the king somewhere else. This is a unified rulership under one figure. Now the kings don't last. We don't have any kings today, after all. Jerusalem is destroyed under the Babylonian Empire around the year 586 BCE. And the line of kings ends with King Zedekiah. And it ends in a very tragic way. The king himself is taken captive. All of his sons are brought in front of him and killed in front of him. And then the king himself is blinded. Now, why would they do that?
Yeah.
Because he is still alive. If they had killed him, someone else could claim to be a new king. But he's a captive and powerless, and so there's no replacing him. So it leaves the people in sort of a limbo position. In the end, he's taken off into exile in Babylon, and the line of the Hebrew kings, the line descending from King David, is ended. Although, in later generations will still try to claim that there is a rightful king to be found. And they give this king a title. The title in Hebrew is Mashiach, which in English is often translated as Messiah. Literally, the Mashiach is the anointed one. When a king is made a king, he has special oil put on his head. That was actually part of the ritual for Charles becoming king recently, if you watched any of that coverage. The anointing is part of that special moment of making the king something else. So the Mashiach is the anointed one, and people would claim periodically to have secretly been descended from King David, and they are the rightful Messiah. And just as an interesting connection for you, the Greek word for Messiah or anointed is Christos. So when people refer to Jesus as Christos or the Christ, they meant the Messiah, the anointed one, the one from the line of King David. If you read the genealogy leading to Jesus in the Gospel of, I want to say Matthew, it includes David in that line. So Jesus' father Joseph, or his father, quote, Joseph, is claimed to be descended from that line. You can even hear it if you listen carefully to the Passover songs, especially the song Eliyahu Hanavi, Elijah the prophet, who's supposed to come as a harbinger of the Messiah. And the second part of the song, after Eliyahu Hanavi, the second part is, Bimhera beyaminu, soon in our days, Yavo aleinu, may he come to us, Im Moshiach ben David, with the Messiah, son of David. Im Moshiach ben David. So this is still hearkening back to the idea of a king who would be anointed and would be the rightful king that would restore the kingdom, claiming descent from the line of King David. So there's always been this backdoor ideal in Jewish political thought of a kingship, a Messiah. That would be the best system possible. But in the end, that didn't come about yet. I mean, I could still be proven wrong, but chances are we're not going to see a Messiah anytime soon. What happens after the kings are destroyed is a new power arises in the Jewish community. It's now the priests. During the time of the kings, there were two religious authorities. There were the priests who worked with the establishment, and there were the prophets who often worked outside of the establishment, telling the priests and kings what they were doing wrong, because they claimed to get direct revelation from Yahweh instead of working through the system. But after the return from exile, around the year 500 BCE, the priests outmaneuvered the prophets because, they said, we now have a book. This book was given to the best prophet who ever lived. His name is Moses. And it is so much of the best prophecy ever that any later prophet who arrives needs to check his prophecy against the book. And if it agrees with the book, then it's fine. And if it doesn't agree with the book, then it is not. Therefore, the prophets are no longer needed. We have everything we need in the book. So the prophets have now been eliminated because we have this written revelation, and it leaves the priests in charge. It's also very convenient for them that Moses disappears at the end of the book with no school of prophecy coming out of him, thus leaving the priests in charge to interpret the book. Well, what that means is they now have almost like a written constitution. It has laws, it has taxation, it has a system that leaves the priests in charge, of course, but it leaves us now with a different kind of government. Instead of a monarchy with a king, you now have rule by the clergy. And rule by clergy is often called a theocracy, right? Now, technically, theocracy means rule by God, but because God doesn't, answer his phone particularly regularly or, sign legislation that often, you have to have the intermediaries. The bureaucracy is going to interpret the divine will, and that's why you have rule by clergy. So if you think about what happens in Iran, if you think about what happens in certain parts of Pakistan, and these are areas that are ruled by clergy. And honestly, in the Orthodox Jewish world, that's also a case where it's ruled by the rabbis who decide what you're allowed to do, what you're not allowed to do, and set limits on what the community can do, including how they vote and so on. So those are also theocracies. The priestly theocracy lasted for quite a while, from about 500 BCE to, we'll say, around 180 BCE. And that's when the Greek provocation arrives, and you have the Maccabean revolt. Now, the Maccabees are a priestly family, but not a high priestly family, so they try to set themselves up as kings. They know they can't be high priests. But the problem is they can't be kings either because they're not from the line of King David. So they're sort of in this netherworld in the pedigree department, but they're in charge. They've won. And so they get to establish their own kingship. But it does lead to some popular unrest from people who are saying, wait a minute, you're not from the Messiah line, you're not from the high priestly line. What gives you the right to be in charge, and why are you making these changes? And in the end, of course, the Maccabees themselves become Hellenized. They start with nice rejecting Greek culture names like Shimon and Mattatyahu, Mattathias and Judah. And after a couple generations, they become Hyrcanos and Aristobulus and even Alexander, the worst Greek name possible, right? So they've been corrupted. And after the end of the Maccabean period really happens when the Romans take over in the 1st century BCE. And people would sometimes argue that that's the end of Jewish politics until the founding of the modern state of Israel. Because if politics is about self-governance with legal authority that relates to other peoples, if it's national independence, then you're right. There was no Jewish national independence other than a brief revolt in the 130s of the Common Era. In an extended sense, there was no Jewish independence until 1948. But I think it's a very limited way to think about politics as only relating to big power politics, fielding an army, wielding taxation, having a police force. There are more ways to understand politics. It's about community relations. It's about how your community runs, how society functions. And after the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, when the priests are now eliminated from power because their major center is gone, we still have a theocracy, but it's a new kind of clergy. Today we call them rabbis. The rabbis now take over as the primary leaders of the Jewish community. And they have a theocracy that runs under a law, but it's not only the written Torah. Now they have a new concept of law they call halakha. Halakha is the meaning of the path, the route, just like the Tao, or in Islam Sharia, it's the same meaning of the path. And so the halakha defined, it's religious law in that it defines religious behavior like prayer and sacrifice and purity laws, but it's also religious law in its sources. It has divine power behind it, and that includes damages and contracts and property ownership and education of the young and ethical behavior. It covers everything, this religious law, this halakha. And so their sources now are the written Torah for sure, but also what they call the oral Torah, and that's what we now call the Talmud and its commentaries and discussions. When a rabbi is ordained, traditionally, there are 2 questions asked and answered. Yoreh, can he teach? Yoreh, he can teach. Yadin, can he judge? Yadin, he can judge, because they were dayan. They were a judge who had to judge the halakha, the law. The rabbinical academies that were creating this law had majority vote to decide what the law was, but it wasn't like they were elected representatives. This is an authority system based on divine power and teaching. It's not a democracy. And at times, the rabbis were recognized by the outside authority. During the the Baghdad Caliphate in the early Muslim Empire period, you actually had 3 Jewish leaders that were a kind of triumvirate that represented the Jewish community to the Muslim Empire. You had the 2 heads of rabbinical academies, at Sura and Pumbedita, and you had someone called the Reish Galuta, which means the head of the exile. It was like a king figure. So there was sort of like a secular power or a political entity, but there were also these religious leaders, and together they represented the Jewish community to the broader power. But that's politics too, right? If you're a minority and you're not fielding an army, but you're relating to an outside power, that's political relationship. And the rabbinic theocracy had 2 systems when it came to law and politics. One of them was Dina de Malchuta Dina, the law of the kingdom is the law. That means if the outside power says this is the law for contracts, you have to follow that law. If they don't make a law in a particular area, then follow the Jewish religious law. But the outside law has to take precedence because we're living under their power. And unfortunately, for most of Jewish history, bureaucracy was pretty weak. Central government was very weak. So they gave the Jews a lot of space to make up their own laws and rule their own communities. You'd make a deal for a right of residence as a group, and then you could run your own affairs under that. The other principle was al tifrosh min hasibur, do not separate yourself from the community. In other words, you have to stay within the Jewish community. It's a tight-knit community, but you have to accept the community authority. And it was very risky to be expelled from that community, to experience what they called cherem, or excommunication. because if you're out of that community, you have no right of residence anymore. Your right of residence is based on the collective, the group that you're part of. And so if you were expelled from the Jewish community, you had to join another religious community or another cultural community that was recognized by the outside power. Otherwise, you're stuck. And remember, all your business contacts, all your family contacts, those are all within the community. So there's an inner political dynamic there of conformity, where people are required to stay part of the community, not just as a positive, wouldn't it be nice for you, isn't it wonderful, I'm warm and friendly here, but also the fear of expulsion, shunning, and total social death, you might call it. Now, these Jewish communities, as they developed their autonomous governance, had, as I said, a collective right to residence. They could also tax themselves somewhat. And you developed a system that in Eastern Europe was called the Kehillah, which is a Jewish self-governing organization, where you could levy your own taxes to pay for your own community affairs. You had your own charitable activities. You ran your own schools, for example. You even appointed your own representative to deal with the outside power. If your residence contract was up as a community, you had to renegotiate. Then you'd send the Shtadlan, the intercessor, to the outside power, and they would negotiate how you were going to be able to stay there. The rabbis ran the internal affairs, the courts. You didn't go to the outside court if you could help it. So you really were your own self-sufficient community. But there were always people who were more equal than others in these settings. In Yiddish, we call them machers. A macher is like a mover, shaker, someone who gets things done. But this system ruled by the machers, I sometimes jokingly call democracy, because it was, they weren't checking everybody's opinion, but they were ruling for the good of the community because they were the important people, the ones with money. And often the ones with money would marry their daughters into the rabbinic group, and so you had this intersection of the rich Jews and the pious Jews running the community. And the poor Jews sometimes were left out of that decision-making process. But there were a lot of positives of this self-organization. They had what were called the chevras, these organizations for doing good for the community, whether it was the Chevra Kadisha, you might have heard of before, that helps dealing with the dead, but also chevras to provide a free kitchen, visiting the sick, clothing the poor, helping the needy. I mean, these were all activities that communities did for themselves, as well as providing schools for those who couldn't afford tutors. Now, what changed in Jewish life, and what really transformed Jewish politics, is emancipation. Beginning in the 19th century, a little bit in the 18th century, but primarily in the 19th century, Jews begin to experience the right of being a citizen of the outside power. And also an outside power that doesn't want them to run their own law courts. You know, the French government was not interested in letting French Jews make up their own laws and enforce their own laws. They wanted one system. Remember the phrase? Liberté, égalité, fraternité. Freedom, but equality for everyone, and brotherhood. We're all one community. They didn't want separate communities within their community. So Jewish law begins to take a back seat. It becomes more of a private decision because the Jews are now subject to the general laws as individual citizens. And by the way, the fear of getting excommunicated is gone. Because if you're an individual citizen now, if the Jewish community kicks you out, fine. So you don't have anything to do on Friday night. But you can still live, you can still work, you can still vote, you can still be part of your broader national community and not be afraid of having to leave as you would have in the Middle Ages. So increasingly, Jewish religious courts and religious communities exert ceremonial pressure. They have, personal association, maybe persuasion pressure, but it's not the legal force they had before. And Jewish politics changes too, because now excommunication is not a fear, it's a social issue, and you have other ways to have a voice in your community, not just working within the Jewish world. You can vote, you can advocate in public, you can organize, and you can organize across religious lines. If you're in a workers' union, for example, it doesn't only have to be a union of Jews, because you're in the factory with all kinds of people. You can see wonderful pictures of protests in the early 1900s where they have the protest signs in English, Italian, and Yiddish, because those were the languages the workers that worked in those factories spoke. The terrible incident of the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, where dozens of young women were killed because they had been locked in a terrible factory setting. Most of the women who died were either Italian or Jewish. And they were working side by side. So when they organized unions, they organized together as well. And that was a way of expressing the needs of their community, whether or not they chose to do it in Yiddish or in a Jewish vocabulary. And ultimately, Jews are now able to be politically engaged in the outside world. If you have a democracy, you can have a political party. You can run as a candidate, you can organize, you can be, whether it's a ward boss or all the way up to running for public office. And so Jews, who were often on the bottom socioeconomically, were open to radical movements to change society. They were susceptible to international ideas because the national cultures of exclusion hadn't served them so well. You know, sometimes they were able to be French citizens, that worked, but the nativist approach of parts of German politics or Russian politics didn't give them a chance. They weren't welcomed as citizens there. And so if they weren't welcome, they were open to other options that might meet their need better, but they organized, again, in political advocacy groups. So modern Jewish politics is really post-Enlightenment. Once we become citizens, now we get to engage in the outside world as well as debate amongst ourselves how we want to organize and what our priorities are. And sometimes it was both. In the Polish government, between World War I and World War II, there were a number of Jewish parties that represented Jewish political perspectives that ran for the Polish parliament. And because Jews were about 10% of pre-World War II Polish population, they elected members of socialist, Bundist, even religious parties to the Polish government. They had enough votes to be able to have representation there. So that was both an internal political discussion of who are we and what are our priorities, but also they were now able to advocate in the general government for what they were hoping would happen in society more broadly. So if you were a Jew living in the early 20th century, I'm going to give you a quick sort of summary of your political options going from political left to political right. So on the far political left, you had the pure internationalists, the world communist organizations, the International Workers' Order, the IWO, which ran schools and summer camps and all kinds of organizations. You were a citizen of the world. If you were Jewish, maybe your roots were in Yiddish, you sang Yiddish songs, but you felt like you were part of an international community. Some of them, by the way, left behind their Jewishness. Think of Leon Trotsky, who took his nom de guerre and left behind Lev Berdichevsky, which was his Lev Bronstein was his birth name. But he wanted nothing to do with being Jewish. Even if others accused him of it, he rejected Jewishness himself. And there were plenty of Jews who fell off in that universalist end on the far left of politics. But there were others who kept their root in Jewish life and still had these universal sympathies, felt that they were part of the global working class, the proletariat, even as they came from Jewish roots. Then moving a little bit to the right of the communists, you have Jewish socialists. This is an organization called the Bund, or in America it took the name Workers' Circle. Originally Workmen's Circle, now it recently changed to be gender neutral, to Workers' Circle. And these Jewish socialists still had socialist sentiments for how society should be organized, how the economy should work, but they weren't necessarily interested in a Bolshevik communist revolution, in a total ownership of private capital, and they also were a little bit more positively engaged in their Jewish roots. They published Yiddish language magazines, ran Yiddish language schools, and they didn't see Yiddish just as the workers' language for now. They saw it as a positive value of a way to organize their Jewish life going forward. Now, just a little bit to the right, because it was still nationalist oriented, was what you would call labor Zionism. Labor Zionism wanted a Jewish state in the land of Israel, but was socialist inclined. This is the kibbutz movement. This is the, there was a group called the Farban, that was the Jewish labor organization, summer camp system, and so on, that ran in the 1930s and 40s into the 50s. And the labor Zionist world wanted there to be a state in Israel, so it was nationalist, it wasn't internationalist like the socialists or the communists were generally oriented, but they took a leftist political perspective. And there were plenty of other Zionist groups as well. You had a centrist Zionist group that were more interested in international negotiations. They were sometimes called political Zionists. You had a right-wing Zionist group that were called revisionists. And these are the ancestors of many of the Israeli political parties we see today. The Likud today is descended from the right-wing but secular Zionist party called the Revisionist Party. There was also a religious Zionist party called the Agudah, and that ultimately is the ancestry of religious Zionism that has multiple parties in the Knesset today. The left-wing Labor Zionists became the Labor Party, for a long time ruled Israel, and now it has offshoots into some of the centrist parties and the Meretz Party, and Labor itself is really a shadow of what it used to be, but that was the origin point for the founding dynamic for Israel, was the Labor Zionist perspective. But there are still Jews as you go even further right. So you've got the communists, the socialists, the Labor Zionists, other varieties of Zionists. You also have people who are integrationists. They're, you might call them liberal social democrats, or just interested in democracy. They are respectable, they're bourgeois. They don't want to move to a far-off land. They don't want to change the language they speak. They speak German, they speak English. They want to integrate into their surrounding society. Some of them might choose the label religiously of Reform Jewish, because they want to integrate to the surrounding culture and not be separated from it, or a moderate kind of reform that we now call conservative, which does make changes, but not so much, and wears modern clothing and speaks modern languages and so on. So you have these integrationists who support a kind of, bourgeois, respectable, center to center left political integration ideology. And you even had, in this early 19th century, some Jews who got involved in nationalist movements. Believe it or not, there were active members in Mussolini's fascist party who were Jewish in the early years, because they were Italian nationalists and they felt like they could be part of the Italian national agenda. Obviously, this falls apart as Mussolini gets closer to Hitler and Hitler begins insisting on anti-Jewish legislation. But the Italians actually have a relatively good track record for hiding Jews and helping Jews throughout World War II, in part because the Italian Jews had been there for 2,000 years. They were well rooted there and they weren't seen as foreign or corrupting in the same way that German Nazi ideology would have it. You even have Jews who were interested in sort of moderate right-wing pro-business parties. Jews actually tended to vote Republican until the 1930s in America, because we have to remember the Republican Party was the party of Lincoln. It was the party of emancipation, the party of moderate civil rights, where the Democratic Party was rural, not urban. It was Dixiecrat, so pro-segregation, anti-civil rights, and it was the party bosses in the big cities that were often run on ethnic lines that excluded Jews, because it was Italians and Irish, and those were the party bosses. So Jews were often left out of that, so they didn't vote Democratic. It wasn't until Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the New Deal arrived that many Jews began to vote Democratic Party as opposed to either socialist or Republican. As it turns out, having a program that employed college-educated people in all the WPA and other agenda, the Alphabet Agenda programs was really attractive to Jews who had sent their kids to college and now their kids couldn't get any work. So they were attracted by that. And FDR adopted a lot of socialist planks like Social Security, like universal employment, and that also drew some Jews from the Socialist Party to the Democratic Party. Today, most Jews tend to be liberal. They're on the left end of the political spectrum. There's a small libertarian voice in the Jewish world as well. You may remember the economist Milton Friedman or the philosopher Ayn Rand, who was born Anna Rosenbaum. These were, Jewish figures, and they represent a certain part of the Jewish community that's interested in a more libertarian approach, socially permissive, but economically more restricted. And there's also some Jews on the right end, pro-Israel voices sometimes, but also Orthodox Jews tend to be much more conservative on both religion issues as well as government size issues. They're relatively small still, as we'll see. And there's also a small group called the neoconservatives who were raised liberal and then became more conservative. But again, it's a very small voice, 10% of the Jewish community, 15%, not very large. And we still have the descendants of that far left world, the Jewish Socialists, Internationalists, and so on, in the Green Party and other movements like that. After all, the most famous Green Party candidate of recent memory is Jill Stein, who is not only Jewish, she grew up in Highland Park, right around the corner. So that legacy of Jewish leftism is still there, and the best poster child for that now in elected office is Bernie Sanders, who is part of that old Jewish socialist left guard. So I just wanted to share with you for a moment a couple of statistics related to Jewish political preferences. I mean, in general, the old aphorism that Milton Himmelfarb, the sociologist, shared about Jewish political preferences still obtains. He said that Jews earn like Episcopalians and vote like Puerto Ricans. That is, they vote very lefty, but their earning level would suggest they would vote more conservative. But they tend to vote more in their sort of ethnic interest rather than their economic interest. So if you look at this result, they asked, which party do you identify with or lean towards, Republican or Democrat or some other party? Overall, for Jews, that's the net Jewish line, 26% lean to the Republican Party and 71% lean to the Democratic Party. That's overall among Jews. But if you look how they break it down by denomination, notice the stark difference. Among Orthodox Jews, 75% identify with or lean to the Republican Party and only 20% Democratic, where for conservative reform and others, it's 70, 80, 75% identify with the Democratic Party versus the Republican Party. So that's a case where there's really a clear split between Orthodox Jews and liberal Jews on their political preferences. But again, you can see why this makes sense, because the Republican Party is in favor of vouchers for private schools that would help Orthodox Jewish schools. They're in favor of public religiosity. They're opposed to LGBTQ rights and advancement. These are issues that they agree with the Orthodox part of the Jewish community. There was even a case recently that hit the Jewish press, at least. In New Jersey, a synagogue wanted to order some kosher cupcakes for a pride event they were doing. So they ordered some rainbow cupcakes from a kosher bakery. And the kosher bakery refused to make the cupcakes because he didn't want to support this lifestyle. Now, the irony was, this was a synagogue that had ordered the cupcakes from the kosher bakery, and the rabbi of that synagogue went to the bakery to try to figure out what happened here. She happened to be a woman rabbi, and it didn't work. In the end, they found another kosher bakery that would make them the cupcakes, but it hit the news that this bakery had refused to make these pride cupcakes, and it even hit the local Jewish community organization, the Jewish Community Relations Council. And there, one of the leaders of that council sent a memo out internally that, of course, became public that said we shouldn't patronize this bakery that doesn't reflect our values. But then the Orthodox Jewish community gets upset because what are you doing boycotting one of our bakeries where we disagree on this issue? So there is no Jewish communal consensus if you go the full spectrum, an LGBTQ inclusion and so on, where if you're only looking at the liberal Jewish part of the spectrum, then we tend to agree on supporting abortion rights and supporting LGBTQ rights, same-sex marriage. These are all issues that the liberal Jewish world agrees on.
The Supreme Court just ruled in favor of that baker.
And the Supreme Court, right, supported the baker, not just the original baker, but in the website designer case as well. So ironically, they have the right to do that. We have the right to boycott them too, or to say we only will patronize businesses that serve everybody. In fact, in Colorado, they are encouraging businesses to print up signs and say, we serve everybody, and those will be the ones you'll want to go to. You do it sort of outside of the law if it's not prohibitable. So this is one of those cases where the Jewish community disagrees. There isn't one Jewish perspective on this, and sometimes it gets played out in public, like that case that hit the news, and sometimes it's backdoor negotiation discussion in Jewish organizations. Now, if you ask about political perspective, as they did in the survey as well, do you describe yourselves as conservative, moderate, or liberal? Overall, only 16% of Jews call themselves conservative, 32% moderate, and 50% liberal. Just by comparison, if you look at the national numbers of all US adults, it's many more can describe themselves conservative, 32 versus 16. And many fewer describe themselves as liberal, 50 versus 25. So we're twice as liberal and half as conservative as the general population. But again, look at the split by denomination. 60% of Orthodox Jews would call their political views conservative. And 55% of Reform Jews would call themselves liberal. Together, liberal and moderate is 92%. So the overwhelming majority of non-Orthodox Jews describe themselves as moderate to liberal. Now, the moderate might have to do with the college education, earning income levels and so on, where they might be, not as big a fan of higher taxation since they actually have to pay at the top brackets. That might be a concern. But overall, Jews tend to the liberal side of the political spectrum even today. And again, it's not a surprise why that's the case, because Jews tend to be college educated, they tend to live in cities, they tend to work in white-collar industries, and those features all correlate to political liberalism. So Jews are politically liberal both because of their Jewish values and history, but also because demographically they fit in categories that tend to political liberal settings. They're not rural, they're not farmers, they're not gun owners. They don't fit the profile of the classical conservative voter. So when it comes to issues that Jews agree on, or liberal Jews agree on at least, we tend to agree on separation of church and state issues, not teaching creationism in science classes in public schools, wanting to minimize prayer in public settings by government officials or by religious officials on behalf of everybody. We support people whose private choices have become political issues, like abortion, contraception, same-sex partnerships. We support freedom on that front as opposed to imposing religious values on them. We tend to have sympathy for immigrants. The Jewish story of coming from immigrants, being a nation of immigrants, descending from immigrants, is very much a part of the liberal Jewish imagination. Although, interestingly enough, that same study of Jewish experience that I cited before found that 90% of American Jews were born in the US. Only 10% of American Jews were born outside the US. But if you think about your own family experience, my guess is the people on this call were born here, and most of the people watching this were born here. My parents were both born here. I had one grandparent. Actually, I had two grandparents that were born outside of the US, and two of them were born here. So I have to go back to great-grandparents for all of them to have been born outside the US. So the immigrant story is not the most common Jewish experience today. Certainly, there are Jews coming from Israel, Jews from the Soviet Union, and so there are immigrant Jews, but it's only 10% of the American Jewish population, and yet we still tend to sympathize with new immigrants coming in, with having a more permissive policy on asylum, having more compassion for immigrants that try to make it across the border, and so on. That's part of our political profile. And in general, we support the promotion of knowledge through public education. We tend not to support vouchers for private schools, especially religious schools. We want secular standards imposed on religious schools, including yeshivas, so that they will teach basic math, science, literacy. That's an important value for us. We may not always agree on the right balance of, should this problem be solved by the government or should it be solved by private industry? Okay, we can have a disagreement over the proper balance of government and private industry. We certainly don't agree on how best to approach the state of Israel as diaspora Jews, because some take the Israel right or wrong perspective, others are willing to offer critique, but defend the right of a Jewish state. And there are Jews today who are questioning of whether an ethnic state is a good idea anyways. They object to the Hindu nationalism that's happening in India and its effect on Muslim minorities and other minorities there. And they say, well, we don't want the Jewish equivalent happening on our name, under our name. So you do get that tension within the Jewish community between those who question the idea of an ethno-state at all, those who support Israel but think it is making mistakes, and those who support Israel no matter what Israel does to the utmost. We have to grapple with this because this is becoming more of a public square issue. It's not just fringe voices that are talking about the varieties of legitimacy to the state of Israel, and even discussing how involved diaspora Jews should be in Israeli political affairs. The current debate in Israel over the judicial overhaul and what changes are going to be made has actually provoked people who before never wanted to let diaspora Jews say anything about what happens in Israel to say, please say something, get involved, advocate. And so it really might, in the long run, change the dynamic of Israeli diaspora relations, which in a ripple effect has an effect on internal Jewish community political debates and engagement. As it is, Jews represent more than our percentage of the population in both the House of Representatives and the Senate. We have a second gentleman who is Jewish, the wife of the spouse of the vice president. We are in the halls of power. Many of the Biden grandchildren married Jewish partners. And Hillary Clinton's daughter also, by the way, married a Jewish partner. So Jews have made it when it comes to American politics, but we still feel sometimes precarious based on recent history. And in the long run, we're never going to agree with each other. In the past, we were able to find common ground to represent a consensus community position. But now, as we have this radical split between Orthodox and non-Orthodox, on conservatism, on public prayer, on public schools even, and we have the ongoing split over what to do with the state of Israel and what voice we should have with it, I'm more doubtful that those consensus Jewish voices, the democracy heirs of the American Jewish Committee and the Council of Presidents of major Jewish organizations, do they really speak for the overall Jewish community, or is our chorus becoming more of a cacophony of different voices that don't agree with each other? And honestly, maybe that reflects the reality. I'll end with a line by Marcia Falk in her Book of Blessings when she talks about some objections she has to traditional teachings. She says, "I'm not trying to be divisive, but we are already of many minds. And pretending that we're not is not going to solve the issue. We have to talk, we have to disagree and argue. In the end, that's what politics is. And I think if Jewish politics gets more contentious in the next 5 to 10 years, both internally and in the public square, it'll be a more honest reflection of who we are, and maybe we can come to a lasting consensus after we get out the bad blood." So I've been talking for a long time. I'm curious if any of you have any thoughts, comments, questions, reactions to any of the stuff that I covered.
Well, we jumped from the kings and the rabbis from the BCE era into the 20th century or the 19th century. And forgive me for not really knowing my history too well, but like when the Jews moved up towards Europe, and then someone had to broker whether or not they could go to Ukraine or whether or not they could go to Austria-Hungary. Were those decided politically by people who weren't Jewish, or was there a case where representatives of the Jewish communities actually brokered the movement of the different tribes up into Europe? So
they weren't tribes by this point. They were just sort of a mass of Israelites, Hebrews, Jews, whatever label you picked on them. But in general, what would happen is a group of Jews would come to the community. They would appoint someone as the intercessor, the phrase in Hebrew, shtadlan, the negotiator.
Right.
And the shtadlan would go to the lord or the duke or whoever was in charge of the territory and work out the terms of the group right to settle there. And so the Jews would be able to run their own affairs. The lord would say, just pay me a flat lump tax amount. And so the Jewish community itself would tax itself to collect the money and then give it to the lord, because they didn't want to bother with, they weren't citizens. They were just temporary residents in a group. So they had group rights, but not national rights or individual rights. So yes, there was always a negotiator that did that, and the Jews had sort of this self-appointed democracy system where the movers and shakers in the community would appoint one of their own to be the negotiator who would go and work out the deal with the Lord. And sometimes, the Lord would cancel the deal, expel the Jews. Sometimes the negotiator was also a moneylender or a banker, and the Lord would get into debt with the negotiator. And sometimes the way to get out of that debt was or kick them all out. So Jewish right of residence was a temporary thing. It wasn't a permanent thing, and it was often being renegotiated. But it absolutely was the case that the Jewish community chose a negotiator to work out the terms of their right of residence. And sometimes they were able to stay there for centuries. And sometimes they had to move more often. And occasionally a national entity would expel them. So we know famously the Spanish expulsion in 1492, but they were also expelled from France in 1391, and they were expelled from England in 1290. So the national entity said, we don't want any Jews here, you all have to leave. And so by 1500, they had basically left Western Europe, or had been forcibly converted. And that's when you really have the rise of Ashkenazi Jews in Germany and in points further east into Poland and Austria-Hungary and the Balkans.
Mhm. And I don't know if somebody else wants to ask a question, but in terms of what's going on in Israel today, do you think that with the growth of the Orthodox community and growing at such exponentially greater numbers than the Ashkenazi community, that inevitably that group is going to control the country?
Well, first to clarify, Ashkenazi just means like Yiddish speaking from Europe background, so a lot of the Orthodox are Ashkenazi.
Oh.
You meant just the secular community.
Secular.
Chiloni is the phrase in Hebrew.
Okay.
So Israel is in an interesting position because there's really three groups ideologically. There's the secular, there's the Orthodox, and then there's a group called traditional. And the traditional Jews, many of them come from a Mizrahi or Middle Eastern background or Sephardic background, and they respect traditional Jewish life, but they might not keep kosher, or they might not observe Shabbat, so they're more flexible on that. And historically, when it came to religious affairs, they sided with the Orthodox because they wanted to keep it traditional. But now they're seeing the dangers of that, and they're beginning to shift. You know, those hundreds of thousands of people that are out there protesting are not only the secular. It also includes a number of those people in that traditional camp. And even in the Orthodox world, there are splits between the ultra-Orthodox, who barely recognize the state at all, and what we would call modern Orthodox here, or there they call religious Zionists. Some of them are fanatic settler, nationalists, but some of them are college-educated people who believe in democracy, who want constitutional protections, who don't like. I mean, there are a number of them out on these reforms, these protests. In fact, they've started doing the protests not only on Saturday night, because the Orthodox people couldn't make it on Saturday night because they couldn't travel before Shabbat's over. But if they do them on Sundays, then the Orthodox, so they're doing protests different days to let those Orthodox who would protest. So the Orthodox world isn't a monolith. Okay. The other thing to keep in mind is that Orthodox birth rates are definitely higher, and they have grown as their proportion of the population. But the secular birth rates in Israel are higher than they are here. Here, American Jews are like 1.82 kids per partnership. In Israel, it's like 3 to 4, even in the secular world. So the Orthodox are not going accelerating as fast as they might be elsewhere, although even here they're not accelerating that fast because they've shown up at 10% of the American Jewish population in surveys done in 1990, in 2000, in 2013, and in 2020. So over a 30-year period, the Orthodox have stayed at 10% of the population. You'd think they would have accelerated. Why not? Well, here's the other factor. Both here and in Israel, not everyone that's born Orthodox stays Orthodox. There's a fair number of people who choose to leave. And the loss rate, depending on the survey you look at, is anywhere from 30 to 50%.
Wow.
Now, they may wind up conservative, they may wind up reform, they may not go totally secular or not Jewish, but they don't stay Orthodox. And if the loss rate is 30 to 50%, so if you have 6 kids, 3 of them are staying Orthodox, 3 of them are becoming some of the liberal style of Jew, and so you're not gaining in the proportion of the population as fast as if all the kids stayed. And that's happened in Israel too. There's a substantial population of ex-Orthodox. In fact, in Hebrew they call it datlash, which means people who are dati, religious, lishavar, who have left it. We know a lot about the Baal Teshuvah, the people who are not religious have become religious. But there's also a lot of people who start religious and become less religious. So, it's a fascinating dynamic. It has changed Israel for sure. And part of the protest movement is mad about the power that the Orthodox parties have in the coalition. And some of the things that have already passed, like the budget already passed. And in that budget, there were a number of things that really annoyed the secular population, including funding for municipalities, taking from more affluent municipalities to give to less affluent municipalities. They're mad about some of the reforms proposed to the draft laws, to give a permanent exemption to yeshiva students instead of a temporary or a limited one. The objection that the secular Israelis often share is, right now in this country, they say, 1/3 of the population goes to work, 1/3 of the population pays taxes, 1/3 of the population serves in the army. The problem is it's the same 1/3 that's doing all those things. And 2/3 of the population are not. So the resentment has grown. And part of the protest movement is protesting the growing privileges of the Orthodox Jewish world there. I don't know what will happen next, whether this protest energy can stay. Since the budget passed, there's no reason for the government to fall right away. And I think that the parties in power realize this is the best deal they're going to get, and they want to stay in power as long as possible. The next scheduled election is in like 3 years. It's a 4-year term. And it may take waiting till that 4-year term to be able to have a new election where this energy gets translated into votes that becomes governing power. You can stay on the streets for a long time, but technically if the government wants to pass the law, they can pass the law. And we'll have to see whether they decide that the tearing in the social fabric is worse than not getting their way. So far, they seem to be willing to push forward.
I just had one. Just curious, your thoughts on how I see some, I think, smaller elements of Jewish society kind of, cozying up to the far right and, in this country, at least, white supremacist ideology. I mean, you had Stephen Miller during Trump talking about, cosmopolitan elites and, using, I find that, you see Netanyahu and Orban, and I read an interesting commentary by Yuval Noah Harari in Haaretz the other day, and he was talking about how if you kind of replace some of Netanyahu's rhetoric and you replace liberal with Jew, then it kind of matches a lot of the old-time anti-Semitic tropes, and that he uses this as being wielded against fellow Jews there. I mean, sometimes I feel like in this country, in some of the commentary on the far right, liberal can be a sort of a dog whistle term for Jew or have an anti-Semitic connotation. So I was just curious of your thoughts on this. If you think it's a trend that will continue. I just find it disturbing, and I think a lot of the kind of ahistorical in a lot of ways. So I'm just curious.
Well, all right. So there's a few different pieces, sort of strands to pull on there. One is on the question of rhetoric and attacking Jews or not. I mean, it's tricky. Like, it is absolutely true that anti-Semites will talk about global elites and globalists, and that Jews will not replace us was one of the marching slogans at the Charlottesville riot. At the same time, sometimes people have a political ideology that doesn't like that perspective. I mean, if I said, I don't like what Hollywood does, am I an anti-Semite, or am I part of the Screen Actors Guild, right? Who are protesting what the Hollywood industry is doing and wages and benefits and so on, So it's not automatic that everyone who talks bad about Hollywood is an anti-Semite. Not everyone who doesn't like globalization is anti-Jewish. If they talk about global ideologies or globalist perspectives. You could be a labor union that doesn't want to see jobs offshored elsewhere. So that's where the rhetoric gets a little tricky, to assume that it's always a dog whistle, that it's always talking about the Jews. When it comes to affinities with right-wing movements, here's where it's again hard to spin out the subtleties, because like a Stephen Miller or someone who is Jewish and white and American and feels that their status is unimpeachable in America, it's like the person who comes in and slams the door behind them. I got in, I'm here, but I don't want any other people coming in or any other people who are different. I'm with you, they say to the white nationalists. I'm white, I'm religious, I support the Judeo-Christian values, and those Muslims who don't, those Hispanics who are brown, those Africans from those blank hole countries, those people I'm happy to keep out with you. So they're trying to make themselves more welcome by ganging up on those other people, right? But they're on the good team that gets to stay. And they haven't yet learned the lesson that's become an internet meme that if you support a party that's called the Leopards Eating People's Faces Party, at some point the leopard is going to eat your face. You know, you can't go saying, I can't believe that, I never thought the leopard would eat my face, but they do. You know, so you cozy up with white nationalists who then decide you're not white, like Nick Fuentes or other people. So this is the difficult bargain that people who are sympathizing with this are trying to achieve. But where they do try to find affinity is on LGBTQ issues, on church-state issues. You might have heard stories recently, by the way, that in some Muslim communities now, they have become outspoken in opposition to LGBTQ inclusion. So in the Detroit area where I'm from, Hamtramck now has a city council that is all Muslim, and they've chosen not to put a pride flag up during Pride Month. They say they don't want to make statements, but they're making a statement by making that statement. Some of the parents challenging books in schools and what's being taught in schools are coming from a Muslim perspective and say that their religious freedom is being restricted by imposing this ideology on their kids. They're not white nationalists. They're not white. But they are finding common cause because of the religious ideology. And so some of the Jews who work in that circle, I'm thinking like Ben Shapiro, for example, he's attracted because of the religiosity and because of the anti-LGBTQ messaging. Now, when it comes to the larger questions, like a Netanyahu reaching out to a Orban or other people, here's where the debate that happens in Israel is two values that are both seen as positive values, but are hard to live both at the same time. And that is Israel being a Jewish and a democratic state. Is it a Jewish state, or is it a state for all of its citizens, including the 20% who are Arab? Is it a democratic state, therefore you shouldn't have a large population that doesn't have votes? That's non-democratic, in which case you should have a two-state solution and let the Palestinians vote for their government and you vote for yours, because right now Israel's military authorities and its governing authority have control over millions of people that never get to vote for that controlling authority. That's non-democratic. But if your priority is a Jewish state and the democracy is less important, then owning the historic Jewish heartland of Judea and Samaria, having a subject population that doesn't vote, that matters less than having a Jewish state. Now, if you went a purely democratic state and gave every West Bank and Gaza Palestinian the vote, you might not have a Jewish star on the flag. You might not have a Hebrew anthem for your national anthem, because it might be a democratic state, but not necessarily a Jewish state. So it's that balance between the Jewish and the democratic that we've tried to sort of straddle the fence for many years. And liberal Zionism wants to be both. It wants to be both Jewish and democratic. That's why, in general, liberal Zionists supported the two-state solution, because that would solve the demography issue. But if you emphasize the Jewish more than the democratic, that's where you get the Itamar Ben-Gvir, the Bezalel Smotrich, and to some extent the Benjamin Netanyahu, who prioritize the nationalism over the democracy. And that's what they have in common with an Orban, with a Modi from India. They're prioritizing an ethnic religious nationalism over democracy. And that's where they find common cause. So that's very heart-wrenching for those of us who do value democracy and don't, we prioritize the Jewish too, but we'd rather live torn than fall over to one side. And that makes it hard for us to maintain an ongoing relationship with the people who think differently.